The church courtyard burned with late afternoon light that hit the stone and turned it into a sheet of gold. Plates of sunlight pooled on white tablecloths, and the scent of jasmine and frying oil mingled in a strange domestic perfume. Evelyn held the edge of her dress the way someone holds a fragile promise, fingers tight enough to blur the lace with sweat. Her chest was a slow drum. In the background, glasses chimed, a child laughed, and someone dropped a napkin that landed like a small accusation. She had spent years stitching life into something presentable for her son. Now every gleam on the polished cutlery felt like a question she had not been ready to answer. The first murmur reached her ears like a small stone skimming water and then rippling everything around it. What happens when a smile cannot hide what everyone is thinking? She had moved through decades learning to make less visible what hurt. She had been the one to open the bakery shop so Michael could go to school. She had closed the shop at midnight, counting coins under fluorescent lights until her fingers went numb. And she had learned how to translate apology into loaves and spare change. To watch Michael in a new suit, so composed it hurt, was a joy that was also a wound. The crowd leaned in without realizing. "Is she really from their circle?" whispered a woman whose name Evelyn later learned was Karen. A spoon scraped a plate like a small admonition. A camera clicked. Those small sounds became evidence. The small comment that should have been swept away turned into the spark. Laura, the bride, smiled politely and then turned her face to suit and shade. A voice behind Evelyn, almost congenial, sighed. "She does not look like the rest." The sound unmoored her. People shifted, and the air tightened as if someone had pulled a cord around the gathering. For a moment, the only thing Evelyn could hear was her heartbeat and the dull thump of judgment. In an instant, a celebration had the shape of a trial. One word could break what had cost her years to build. Or one word could begin to mend a rift she had not known how to name. Would a woman who had given everything fight back or find a way to reach out? The ceremony began with ritual motions that felt both sacred and dangerously public. Vows were exchanged, the priest spoke in a voice that vibrated in Evelyn's bones, and the ring felt too small to contain the tensions threading the room. Sensory details sharpened the scene. The satin of Laura's gown shone like a cool moon. The taste of sugar from an offered petit four sat in Evelyn's mouth like an accusation. Sunlight warmed the backs of guests, but a breeze carried the thin scent of car exhaust from the street and a faint hint of wet dog from a passing. A delivery van. Michael's smile was steady, his hands warm and sure when they found Evelyn's arm, but his gait suggested he carried a country between his shoulders. At the head table, Susan, Michael's sister, adjusted a napkin and glanced toward a cluster of women led by Nora, whose laugh was precise and sharp. Conversation in small knots scrolled like closed captions, questions about old money, about schooling, about hairdressers, about names. Each clause felt like an attempt to locate Laura in the social map they all assumed existed. A scene at the reception intensified the murmurs into visible moves. The hall smelled of spilled wine and wax. Candles guttered and threw shadows that looked like fingers. The music thudded a polite rhythm. Evelyn moved through tables, hands touching chairs, collecting the delicate balance of things that could be kept. She encountered Daniel, an old friend of Michael's, who said, "Eve, you did this." His voice was a ribbon of admiration and surprise. Then, across the hall, Karen and Emily leaned in close and shared a look that read less like curiosity and more like verdict. The cake was cut. A waiter knocked a glass and apologized as if crumbling under pressure. Dialogue spiraled and widened with precise exchanges that revealed character and fracture. "You look amazing," said Laura to Evelyn, a line perhaps true and perhaps diplomatic. "You did not have to do this alone," Evelyn replied, voice small and steady. "I wanted him to feel no gap," Michael said. "There are gaps you cannot see," murmured Nora. "Who taught her to behave like that?" someone else whispered loud enough for luncheon to stop. Backstory arrived like a quiet dossier laid on the table, 3 short portraits that explained why Evelyn clung to both ceremony and silence. As a child, she remembered mornings of cold kitchen tile, the smell of yeast, and the distant radio hum of late shows. Her mother had taught her how to measure sorrow in cups and how to set dough to rise and keep faith that warmth would come. She learned about economy not as a lesson in scarcity alone, but as a kind of art that required bravery. In school, she read books borrowed from a library where pages smelled of dust and hope. She fell in love with the idea that effort could translate into dignity, and she allowed that belief to guide much of her life. Those early years taught her to hide fatigue behind rhythm, to turn scarcity into discipline, and to celebrate small victories as if they were altars. As a young woman, she married, gave birth to Michael, then rebuilt her life around his future. When the marriage did not survive, she opened the bakery, learned accounts and late nights, and became a quiet fixture of the neighborhood. She watched other mothers parade privileges that had nothing to do with struggle. She learned to braid pride and shame into a single strand. She taught herself to listen more than speak, to negotiate her presence with frugality, and to believe that love must be practical. She believed in gestures measured by usefulness rather than display. That belief often looked like humility. It sometimes cut her off from places where other choices were celebrated. Now, in the present, she had a son whose milestones demanded her presence, and whose happiness she wanted to shield from the kind of comments that had once hollowed her out. She was older in ways that felt both softened and sharpened. The wedding forced her past into the light, and the crowd sifting for cues felt like a test. Everything she had done to ensure Michael's comfort now existed in the face of strangers who measured worth in different currencies. The history in her hands was heavy and sacred, and explained why she flinched when a joke landed. A first moment of tension unfolded at the head table and held attention like a slow tightening knot. Laura's smile faltered when a family friend named Carlos made a remark about upbringing. The atmosphere shifted. "I did not know anyone had come from such humble beginnings," he said, with the casual cruelty of a man who mistook curiosity for dominance. Voices faltered and then formed in a chorus of speculation. Evelyn felt the room shrink and tilt. She answered softly, "We did what we had to." Michael's jaw tightened. People turned as if a spotlight had found them. Silence that followed pressed like a hand against the throat. The exchange left a residue of shame that smelled faintly of citrus and old varnish. During the reception, a private confrontation grew into something public. The dialogue extended in the way it must because secrets could not stay behind closed mouths. "Did you tell them about the bakery?" Laura asked Evelyn later, not unkind, but with the clarity of someone trying to place a piece on a board. "I did not think my life needed a label," Evelyn said. "Labels matter," Laura countered. "They do to some people," Evelyn replied. The back and forth grew, and in the 6th exchange, the room felt like a stage. Michael stepped in with a plea. "This is not the moment to divide us," he said. "She is my mother," he added, trying to collapse the space. Laura's voice wavered and then steadied. "I want us to be honest," she said. The group around them shifted, some siding with openness and some with decorum. The conversation landed like a stone in a pond and sent new rings of speculation outward. Around 30% into the evening, the script asked the audience to participate. If the murmurs had tightened your chest, you are not alone. Have you ever been in a room when a single sentence changed the mood of everyone there? Share your moment. Start your comment with "I saw" and tell where it happened and how you remember feeling. Your memory matters because it connects this story to others, and your voice can change how we understand moments that otherwise become private wounds. This community listens to stories to learn how to heal and how to act with kindness in public places. Thank you for sharing. Now we return to what happened when the whispered judgments began to coalesce into action. The terrace became an island of confession. Outside, the air smelled of wet stone and lemon from a nearby vendor. Streetlights dripped milky halos through a curtain of steam rising from a manhole. Rain had started, then stopped, and left a sheen that made every surface a mirror. Evelyn stepped away from the crowd and sat on a low wall. Laura came out after her, hands tucked into the folds of her dress, hair damp with a loose curl. Their dialogue flowed with the slow intensity of people negotiating truth. "I did not mean to sound like that," Laura said. "I do not know how to be anything else," Evelyn answered. "We are standing on different floors of the same house," Laura said. "We could open the staircase," Evelyn suggested. They spoke in 6 exchanges that mapped fear and possible repair. Each line carried taste and texture. Evelyn could smell the soap on Laura's hands, a clean citrus that made the memory of frying oil sharper. The night air carried the echo of laughter like a promise. For a moment, the world felt malleable. Then an interruption arrived like an electric fault. Michael's phone buzzed with a message that made his face change, as if someone had reset his expression without permission. He read and then paled. "I have to go to the office," he said, voice brittle. A message had come through wrongly addressed, a note about a complaint at the bakery that named Evelyn on a list of vendors who had failed to meet a license requirement. The content of the message was short and formal and carried the weight of a legal tone. "We received reports," it said in clinical words that made the room tilt. Evelyn felt her stomach drop into an ocean of small bills and late nights. The interruption turned tenderness into practical crisis. The mechanics of paperwork, of inspections and fines suddenly entered the wedding as an external force. A county inspector named Judge Ramirez was mentioned, and the possibility of a fine laced the air. The technicalities required were described in a brisk account that lasted only a few minutes, but changed the evening's trajectory. That moment expanded into chaos when rain returned in earnest. The storm outside matched the inner weather. Guests scrambled to move chairs and cover table decor. The sound of rain hitting canvas tents was like applause for a tragedy. Maria, the wedding planner, shouted instructions that were both precise and fraught. "Move the cake," she said. "Secure the files," Michael shouted back. Daniel, who had been gentle all night, ran to help with plates. In the middle of the rush, someone bumped a lantern and a candle flared. A heater coughed and then stilled. The storm made faces look raw, as if the weather had peeled varnish from manners. In the middle of this literal tempest, a revelation crackled. A woman named Alex, a mutual acquaintance, handed Evelyn an envelope she had found in a stack near a sign-in table. In it was a letter from a former landlord that praised Evelyn and provided proof of timely payments and character references. The small paper was a salve and also a trigger. It proved that the paperwork could be contested, but it also brought to light that someone had tried to taint Evelyn's reputation by calling attention to a technicality when the aim looked like social exclusion rather than civic duty. A second major tension unspooled across 2 paragraphs that slowed the pace. The allegations flared and then met counter-evidence. Evelyn read the letter with hands that trembled. Part of her felt vindicated, part of her felt humiliated that proof was needed at all. She stepped back to watch Michael and Laura argue in whispers about whether the envelope should be shown to the inspector. "We cannot let this ruin the night," Michael said. "If we say nothing, we allow it to be true," Laura replied. Their exchange pulled different ethics into sharp light. Guests divided into camps, some calling for immediate resolution, others anxious to preserve the party. The decision to engage with the claim would define how they presented themselves as a unit. It felt like a referendum on belonging. A third moment of tension came with mediation. Pastor James, who had presided over the vows and was known for a calm tone, stepped in to de-escalate at Karen's request. He had a presence that smelled faintly of old church oil and aftershave. His first words were a call to listen. The mediation was a scene of 8 deliberate exchanges that allowed voices to be heard rather than silenced. "Tell me what you fear," he asked Laura. "I fear my family will think I chose poorly," she answered. "Tell me what you want to protect," Michael said to Evelyn. "I want my son to feel at home," she said. "We want the same," Michael said. "Then we begin by acknowledging harm," Pastor James suggested. The conversation moved slowly, naming hurts, naming small acts of exclusion, and also naming the ways each person had tried to belong. The antagonist in the evening, Nora, spoke a compact backstory in 3 paragraphs about her upbringing that explained her distance. She described a childhood where social standing was a shield and where vulnerability felt like threat. Her story was not an excuse, but it provided context that opened a route toward empathy. A turning point arrived when Laura took an action that unsettled people and then healed them. She stood up in front of the crowd and spoke with a rawness that contained no polish. "I assumed things were as they seemed," she said. "I judged what I could not see." Her voice carried over music and chatter. She admitted that she had been afraid of losing standing and that she had lent her ears to people who framed class as a weapon. The confession worked as a hinge. Some listeners felt relief, others scorn, and some praised the courage. "I was wrong," she continued. "It is not our place to exile someone for origin. It is our place to welcome them." A hush followed, and then applause built slowly like a tide. Susan hugged Evelyn and said, "We are a family," in a voice that shook. Daniel wiped his eyes, and Karen, who had been sharpest, looked away with a new softness on her face. The reconciliation opened a path, though not an immediate erasure of pain. The scene required a subscription CTA that fit the emotional shift. If this honesty moved you, subscribe to follow stories where mistakes become lessons and strangers become family. We bring you real moments of fallibility and repair so you can watch how ordinary people grow. Join us for more stories that show how small acts of courage can change the narrative of a whole room. After the revelation, the mood shifted into repair work rather than triumph. People started cleaning up with hands that wanted to touch rather than point. Maria coordinated volunteers to help the bakery issue be reviewed after the wedding. Alex and Emily offered to vouch for Evelyn at the inspection. Local neighbors who had known Evelyn for years began to approach with evidence of her steadiness and warmth. The practical steps included a promise from Michael to sit with Evelyn and pursue documentation, a pledge from Laura to send a note to her guests clarifying what had happened, and an offer from Pastor James to set up a community meeting. The acts were small and concrete. They looked like errands and signatures and cups of coffee. They were the labor of reweaving trust. The epilogue traced change over time, marked in months and gestures that accumulated into real transformation. 1 month later, the couple had organized an informal neighborhood table where Evelyn's bakery treats were featured at no charge to welcome those who had not known her. Michael and Laura hosted the event in a small park gazebo. The weather was mild, and the smell of cinnamon rolls mingled with cut grass. A sign read "Community Table," and people from different walks of life ate side by side. Nora brought flowers and apologized privately to Evelyn with a card that said, "I am sorry and I want to learn." Maria, the planner, arranged for a small column in the local paper that described Evelyn's contribution to the neighborhood, including a recipe and a note about integrity. Those small public recognitions mattered. They acknowledged that the earlier accusation had been less about a civic duty than about a social test. 3 months later, Michael and Evelyn had begun a formal process to contest the inspection claim. They met with the county clerk, filed the necessary paperwork, and produced proofs that cleared Evelyn's name. Judge Ramirez agreed to a review and corrected the record. The bakery was inspected and found compliant with minor adjustments that were promptly made. More importantly, the process had become a narrative of community accountability rather than shame. Laura published a personal note on social media acknowledging the misstep in judgment and invited followers to volunteer at the neighborhood table. Comments poured in, many offering support and a few offering critique. The conversation continued and matured. Evelyn was invited to teach a small class at the community center about baking and budgeting, and she accepted. Teaching became a way to convert private labor into public gift. 6 months on, the changes were visible in concrete and tender ways. The family organized monthly dinners to speak together without an agenda. Michael and Laura invited Evelyn to co-host the next wedding rehearsal for a cousin, and she agreed. The bakery had new customers who came because they had read about the story and wanted to support a local life. Karen and Nora came for coffee and stayed to help frost cookies. The community table continued and had become a small institution that connected people across assumed divides. Evelyn had begun to write a short memoir of sorts, dictated into a recorder that she later gave to Michael. It was not a book for sale, but a vessel for memory. The final image held a line of rain-washed chairs at a community table, where hands full of pastries reached across steam and light. The last sentence lingered like a photograph. In the end, the wedding did not just unite two people, it expanded the circle that could keep them safe. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see how small acts of courage and a single apology can change the shape of a family.